Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation. This is where we open discussion of our journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. And for our program today, we are particularly glad to have with us today the author of the lead article in the journal. The article is called Virtue and Artificial Intelligence, and we welcome Derek Schuurman to the program today. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here. So I think, first of all, as I think most of the people here know, and Derek, we want you to know that we extend to you our deepest sympathies in the loss of your wife less than 3 months ago. So it's very close, and I know it's really a hard time for you, but we appreciate you being here with us and being able to focus and share with us some of the ideas that you've had in putting this together.
Now, Randy, I was going to say too, I'm really grateful. I know that many people in the ASA were praying for me through her illness and afterwards, and it's great to be part of an organization that isn't just academic discourse, but we encourage and pray for each other too. And so I'm grateful for that.
Yes, you certainly do have our prayers, exactly, which is great. So since I think most people know your name, but my guess is few people are really familiar with you and who you are. So I'd like to start out with letting people get to know you a little bit more. So let's get started. Where were you born? Where you were raised?
Well, I'm a Canadian, so I'm an expat here and currently living in the States, but I grew up in Toronto and went to the University of Waterloo just down the road from Toronto for electrical engineering, and did a bachelor's and a master's there, and spent most of my time in Canada until more recently.
Oh, all right. So you got a master's in engineering, you said?
Yeah, I got a bachelor's and master's at Waterloo, and then went into industry for about 9 years after that.
Excellent. Where did you start? Which company did you start with?
Neither of them still exist. They were two startups.
There's no causal relationship, though. Right?
No, I hope not.
No.
As an undergrad, I was part of a co-op program at Waterloo and had an opportunity to work at IBM and Hewlett Packard and some other wonderful.
Okay.
But ended up working in small companies, doing work on motor drives and servo controls, also for robotics, and then started to feel a tug towards teaching at one point. I did some teaching in the evenings, and at one point, with the blessing of my wife, I quit my job and went back to do a PhD at McMaster University when I was in my early 30s, and we had 3 kids and a mortgage. So I had a very understanding wife.
That must have been tough, right?
Yeah, it was. I was also nice. It was a different pace than working in high-tech startups. And I loved the academic life of the mind, and was delighted to be able to make that career shift. And then as my PhD was ending, I ended up teaching at Redeemer University College down the road in Hamilton, Ontario.
Okay.
Spent a number of years there at the beginning of my teaching.
Well, let's back up a little bit, Derek. What is it in your life that led you into engineering?
I was always fascinated by electronics. I was a hobbyist, so my hobby essentially led to my vocation. I was probably giving away my age here, but I was a teenager when the first personal computers were beginning to make their way on the stage. And my very first computer was a Timex Sinclair ZX81, which
all right,
which was awesome to me. It was 1 kilobyte of memory. You hooked it up to your television, and you saved and loaded programs from an audio cassette. But it was magical. And then I also got my ham radio license, so I'm a ham radio operator. I know.
All right.
Bob Geddes here is also a ham radio operator. Yes. I saw him online here, and then got really interested in hardware as well as software, and that led me to go on to study electrical engineering.
Oh, that's neat. That's
Yeah.
great background. Yeah, it's a great world to live in and for all that. Can you spend a few minutes on your faith background? How did you grow up in your family?
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian family. I grew up in Reformed circles. I went to the attended the Christian Reformed Church.
Mm-hmm.
Went to Christian grade school and high school, and
Mm-hmm.
so I was sort of incubated in a Christian community, and and sort of grew up knowing the Lord and learning about the biblical story along the way, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, um, and so my faith was always very important to me. But I confess, when I was working in industry and prior to that, in my undergraduate days, the kind of education you get at a big technical school doesn't leave a lot of time for, unfortunately, cultivating the inner life or even thinking about integration of faith and learning.
Mm-hmm.
That came a little bit later in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
when I went back to do a PhD at McMaster University, I began to have more time to think. And then as I began my teaching career at Redeemer College, I just loved the opportunity to be immersed in a Christian academic community and to be and interact with other Christian scholars in many other disciplines, theology and philosophy and social sciences. And my faith grew in terms of its scope and understanding the implications for all of life in terms of
Mm-hmm.
the Christian faith.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
how did you happen to learn about the ASA?
It was while I was at Redeemer. I think it was people like Bob Geddes and the local Hamilton
Mm-hmm.
community there that nudged me and others at Redeemer at the time to come and join the Hamilton Science and Faith Forum. And that was closely tied with the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation, the sister
Mm-hmm.
organization, the CSCA, which got me plugged into the larger community of the ASA and the journal. And that became part of the resources that helped me develop as a Christian scholar as well. And in fact,
Mm-hmm.
at one point, I was invited to become a book review editor for the PSCF by
Right.
Peterson, and I've been doing that for the last number of years.
You're still doing that, right?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a book, and so I put in a little plug in. If there are people who are interested in reading and reviewing books that have to do with technology,
Mm-hmm.
then to feel free to reach out to me. Um,
Yeah. And so what got you into writing? You've written a couple of books and gotten into writing on this topic. How'd you move into that?
so when I first started teaching as an assistant professor, I was, trying to continue my technical research, and I was able to do that for a while. It's always a challenge at a small Christian liberal arts institution to be able to continue to do high level technical scholarship, although many do.
Mm-hmm.
But as I began to grow as a Christian scholar, I became more intrigued by some of the more philosophical questions. It's kind of interesting how I've gone up the hardware stack. I sort of started with,
Yeah.
transistors and ham radios, and then got into software, and then sort of got into data structures and algorithms and computer vision and philosophy and
Right.
theology. My interests have been sort of leaning more in that direction. And what's wonderful about a Christian college is that's a legitimate area of
Mm-hmm.
scholarship. And what's
Yeah.
even more wonderful is that when you're part of a lively Christian scholarly community, you can interact with professors and all kinds of other disciplines, including
Mm-hmm.
philosophy, theology, which I found really, really helpful. Whereas in a secular university, you're often much more siloed from other departments. I
Sure.
found it quite
Yeah.
stimulating. And I've since moved to Calvin College. I haven't mentioned that yet. I'm at Calvin University, actually, it's now called,
That's where you
Grand
are
Rapids,
now, right?
Michigan. And I've been here for the last 7 years, and I'm part of a large Christian scholarly community here as well. And so
Mm-hmm.
as I developed that interest, I began to write for a reformed newspaper in Canada called Christian Courier. I did, monthly columns on
Mm-hmm.
technology related topics, and then those began to sort of help me develop ideas in my head, and I began to write a book which came out almost 10 years ago now called Shaping a Digital World,
Mm-hmm.
which was a book about faith and computer science. And then there was a diving deeper discussion a couple of years ago when I was part of another book project that I helped to co-author about
Mm-hmm.
faith and engineering called The Christian Field Guide to Technology for Engineers and Designers. And I've loved writing and I continue to write. I'm currently also writing for the Christian Scholars Review blog, which is
Mm-hmm.
available online on topics related to faith and technology as well.
Right. Yeah. So Derek, you've really touched on a lot of different things in your career here, a lot of different
Mm.
aspects of engineering. How did you get into this particular topic, into AI and
Yeah,
virtue?
yeah, good question. So, although my time in industry was spent mostly with motor controls for robotics and servos and industrial electric vehicles, when I did my PhD, I sort of shifted into a different area, and I got into computer vision, robotic computer vision. And when I was surveying the different computer vision techniques that were available at the time, one of the ones that looked really intriguing to me was the ones that rely on machine learning. So the sort of traditional old-fashioned computer vision that relies on 3D geometry and projecting scenes onto a 2D plane and requires, elaborate camera calibrations and optical workbenches and all this sort of stuff. And then there was sort of this machine learning approach where you actually just train an algorithm. You use machine learning to take a series
Mm-hmm.
of images and you learn the appearance of something. And so I used machine learning to use computer vision as applied to computer vision to measure robot position. And so I
Mm-hmm.
began to use machine learning. I wasn't a machine learning developer or researcher, but I was a
A
user,
user. Mm-hmm.
and then continued to use machine learning in my research subsequently too. Went on to um, um, work with my undergraduate students, and I co-supervised a few grad students at McMaster doing work in using support vector machines and other machine learning techniques to sort recyclable goods visually. So finding ways to
Mm-hmm.
find a high-speed way of sorting recyclable goods, which seemed like a redeeming application of AI and machine learning, since many of the algorithms that I had been using in my PhD were actually used for face recognition and for other things that were laden with privacy and
Right.
issues and so on. And I was looking for more redeeming applications for some of these algorithms.
Yeah. So that obviously leads you into AI, and so what kind of so you've done a lot of writing, but what led you into thinking about virtue in the context of AI?
Yeah, yeah. So I have a colleague here at Calvin whose name is Rebecca DeYoung, who wrote a book called Glittering Vices. And she is a philosopher here who has done a lot of writing about virtue and vice. And I actually audited one of her classes, and I've had conversations with her, and I became more intrigued with the idea of virtue and virtue ethics as applied to technology and work in engineering. And then the topic of virtue and artificial intelligence actually came up last summer. I was invited to participate in a CTNS um, dialogue that's at the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. It's the
Hmm.
Center for
Right.
Theology and Natural Science. They were running an event conversation last summer dealing with virtue and AI, and I was invited to participate. And so I started throwing some ideas against the wall and had an opportunity to present sort of some rough ideas about this topic. And they actually encouraged us to develop those ideas further and seek publication. And so I worked further in the summer on this topic and submitted it to the journal. So it was triggered by some initial interest in virtue and virtue ethics, but then this CTNS um, event over the summer was sort of the trigger to specifically look at whether there were connections between virtue and AI
Hmm.
explored.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So, um, we've had the article available for listeners. Most of the listeners have have undoubtedly already read the article, so uh, people are familiar with it. So our purposes here are to open this up for discussion among our members. So Becky, I'd like to ask you to open up the microphones so that people can unmute themselves. But again, our process here, as usual, keep your microphone muted in all cases unless you're called upon to talk. So we will start with our questions submitted in advance, but after we finish that, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raised hand feature. You know where it is, either directly in the reactions button or in your more button, and underneath it is reactions, and there's an option for raising your hand. Please activate that, and I'll call on you in the sequence in which you raise your hand. And we'd ask that when you're called upon, you can unmute yourself and make your comment. So, as usual, we start with questions submitted in advance. And guess who has the first question? As always, is Del Kuhn. Del, good to see you again. And go ahead, although maybe a little abbreviated version of what you sent in advance, but that's good.
Okay,
Go ahead.
thanks, Randy, and thanks, Derek. Uh, I feel odd. I think my high school teachers always knew the ink would be wet on my assignments as I turned them in. But Derek, appreciate the article. It really got me thinking. First of all, why not use AI as a coach to get ideas for living a virtuous life? And I'm thinking of Henry Kissinger's expectation that AI is going to change our relationship with information in about similar to the way printing press did. So I'm thinking from a terms of somebody who is going to grow up seeing the success of AI systems and correctly pulling out relationships in large data sets and thinking that it would not be a big leap for that person to attribute agency and even virtue as something that would be built into an AI system. And I'm not going to be in that category because I think that an AI system is always going to be a truncated version of a human because it's relying on math. And since you quoted Aristotle, I'm going to go ahead and use the classical vision of reason being the charioteer driving the horses of emotion and high-spiritedness to a virtuous life, and thinking that AI is going to be a charioteer with no horses. But my question is, I'm not today's 10-year-old who's going to have grown up with AI and in 2050 is going to be asking an AI system, how can I live a good and virtuous life? So my question is, going forward from that for that hypothetical 10-year-old, what is his interaction with information going to be? And do you have any suggestions of making sure we help that 10-year-old grow up to be a fully human being with human underlined?
Yeah. Okay, let me tackle one of the first questions that came up, where how will AI will change the relationship to information. I just wrote an article that appeared in Christian Scholars Review blog called AI and Truth in a Post-Epistemic World. And so talking about some of the ways that AI can be used to distort truth, starting with the well-known kind of effect in large language models to hallucinate at times, which generates false information. I mentioned something called latent persuasion, where you can actually have an AI that's trained with a particular worldview. If you have a system that's constantly suggesting with text prompts what you ought to write, it can be like a little Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder that's whispering in your ear, and some studies have shown that it can actually change our opinions. And then there's also the ability to weaponize large language models to place lots of messages out on the internet in order to sway people's opinions. So there's lots of different ways that that AI can be used for misinformation, unfortunately. Um, but in my paper, when I asked the question, can AI be used in the acquisition of virtue, um, I actually say yes. But it's it's not going to be the complete story. Likewise, AI can also be used to encourage vice, and I give a couple examples of that in the paper as well. But the paper ends with sort of looking at the notion of virtue in the Christian tradition and how it isn't just about the individual, but it's about something, especially Christian virtues like humility and love and so on, that actually have to be practiced within community. It's not just something you can learn on your own by reading books, and so on. So I think AI um, could be used to help people in the acquisition of virtue, but it's incomplete on its own. And so that I think that might answer different aspects of the question you posed. Randy, is there anything else I
Yeah.
should add to that?
No, I think that's fine. But what it occurs to me as I'm listening to Dell and to you here is the, the similarity between artificial intelligence system and a natural intelligence system. I mean, if you think about a baby that's born, you basically have an intelligent agent there that needs a database, needs a training database, and we provide a couple of dozen, you know, uh, 10, 15, 20 years of training. And that natural intelligent agent is exposed to an environment in which they learn virtue, they learn vice, whatever. I mean, there's a training environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so clearly for AI, the analogous thing, we try to just plug it in, it's not going to work. We have to train them. And the biggest issue is, how does this AI system get trained? And I think you were probably here when Joanna Ning on our program talked about AI and the sources, the database, and everything it is. So I guess what this leads to in this question here about the 10-year-olds and the virtue is really comes down to training, doesn't it? In terms of how what database is used to train the whole AI system, and isn't that going to determine whether it's virtuous or has vice?
Yeah. Okay. So now the question about whether an AI system can be virtuous is the other question I deal with in my paper. So I sort of split it into two different questions. Can
Right.
an AI help you develop virtue? And the other question is, could an AI system itself be virtuous? And I sort of pose the question kind of, that the question, can we train an AI in the way, can we train up an AI in the way that it should go? Kind of paraphrasing
Right.
this about training up a child in the way that he or she should go. And and so in that part of the paper, my answer is basically no, and I give a rationale, again quoting some of the Greeks as well, but saying that a machine, in order for something to be virtuous, they need to have moral responsibility, and they have to have moral agency. They have to be able to make a choice. And so I grabbed these two conditions from the Nicomachean Ethics text from Aristotle, and he says in order to have moral agency, you need two conditions. There's the control condition. You have to be able to make a choice as an agent between one thing and another. And the second condition is the epistemic condition, is that you have to know and be aware of what you're doing. And I make the argument that an AI system, even though it's trained and so on, it lacks both of those things. It lacks the ability to control itself because it's basically responding to lots of computations in a neural network that are pre-tuned and preset. And it lacks the epistemic condition, which is one that requires awareness of actually what you're doing. And so And so I make the argument that an AI is not virtuous, cannot be virtuous in that sense. But then I give a little bit of a, um, uh, I have a little bit of a thought experiment, and I talk about the notion of virtue by proxy. You know, if an AI itself can't be virtuous, could a programmer um, program into an AI system, which will be separated from the programmer in both time and space? Could a programmer set up an AI system such that it's able to mimic virtuous behavior? Um, to kind of behave in a way that's in accordance with virtue. So you would try to make an AI system, if it were an autonomous vehicle, to make it a courteous driver. If it were some kind of system that would interact with the public, that it would be patient and that it would show care, and so on. And so I talk about the notion of virtue by proxy, but then I also quickly go on to say the many different ways that it would fall short from true
Mm-hmm.
virtue. So that's sort of how I tackle the question about an AI, whether or not it could be virtuous itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. But basically, if this 10-year-old boy that Dell is worried about in
Mhm.
2050, if you want him to be virtuous, you really need to surround him with AI systems that have been trained in virtue.
Well, I would say hopefully he's not just surrounded by AI systems. Like he needs to be developed. It takes a village to raise a kid. So, in the latter part of the paper, I talk about how virtue in the Christian tradition is very different than in the Greek tradition in some ways. And one of the ways is the fact that we believe that the development of virtue is not just us working on ourselves, but it's also the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, and it's the work of the larger community that we're embedded in, because many Christian virtues need to be practiced in the context of community. For instance, humility. You can't just learn that on your own. You have to be working with others,
Mm-hmm.
and so I make the argument that an AI can help nudge us. Technology can nudge us in so many ways. You can think of dieting apps or meditation apps or personal devotion apps that could actually nudge us in ways that would be helpful in terms of formation. You can think of many, many examples of vice being encouraged by AI systems that encourage us to binge watch or get addicted to certain things, or amplified lust or greed or envy, a whole bunch of it. Well, basically they've monetized all of the seven deadly sins in one way or another digitally. And so AI could be used to help assist with virtue and vice formation, but that true virtue formation requires more than just machine nudges. It's exercised within
Mm-hmm.
the larger community and is done in participation with the Holy Spirit in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
so yeah,
In
I
a lot
hope
of
that
aspects.
it tackles the different aspects of Dell's question.
Randy, Derek, can I
Go
just
ahead.
throw one in? This is open-ended, and I don't expect you to answer it. Given my 10-year-old today, as he's growing up with successful AI systems in his environment, I wonder how he will see himself as a different sort of entity than the machines he's growing up among.
Yeah, no,
Mm.
that's a
Analogous to how some of us have learned to see ourselves as animal models given the last 150 years of evolution. And I don't want to open that can of worms, but it's really how will the child see himself as a different sort of information acceptor, processor, and so forth in the next generation? Open-ended, I don't expect an answer, just kind of laying it
right.
out.
Well, I hope the child sees himself as more than an information processor and acceptor, that the child sees him or herself as made in the image of God, as distinct from machines. So machines are machines and people are people,
Mm-hmm.
and that the ontological confusion between people and machines is something that isn't encouraged. And I say this to my students too, as well. I mean, we teach artificial intelligence here at Calvin, and I say, it's probably a good idea not to build machines that look like people or pretend to be people, pretend to be human, because I think that actually leads to a kind of ontological confusion over time. And so I think we need to build machines that can be helpful assistants, that can be, well, nudge us in ways that are helpful and help show love to neighbor and so on. But we should always make sure that it's understood also in the design and interface that a machine is a machine and that it isn't pretending to be a person. And I think that will really help avoid what we naturally always do, which is anthropomorphize our machines. And especially when they're black boxes and they're interacting with you in ways that seem plausibly human, it's very, very easy to just attribute that to the machine.
Mm-hmm.
So my call is to build machines that don't pretend to be human because ontologically they're not. And so, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Okay, good. Yeah, let's move on. Terry, good to see you here. Go ahead.
Hello. I figured there would be a few more pre-posted questions.
No, you just won this time.
But so Derek, thank you for your paper, and I want to make just one comment about your very, very brief reference to Dewey Word, Herman Dewey Word in your paper, and invite you to maybe expand on that a little bit if you want.
Yeah.
Very good. But 100-year-old philosopher, theologian, to be relevant in this debate and discussion is something that I think is very interesting. So you can comment on that if you want. But my question that I want to pursue a little bit is it seems to me that your belief that the computers and AI are fundamentally different from human beings is not necessarily rooted in the what we think about technology, or even I don't know if I want to call it a scientific perspective of things, but is really rooted in your Christian presuppositions. And it seemed to me in your paper you were rejecting this idea that the artificial intelligence was closely related to human intelligence, was not based on I don't know if I want to call it the science, but I want to get you to talk a little bit, if you would, about suppose you didn't have those presuppositions about what a human being is and being in the image of God. And so a lot of secularists are coming at this question without those presuppositions about the uniqueness of human beings. And in that case, it seems to me that these, and I actually agree with you about all of those presuppositions and so on. But I just wonder if you might explore the possibility of from a non-Christian materialist perspective, our AI is just at the beginning of sort of developing a sophisticated way of dealing with all of these issues. And is it just a matter of time before our machines, if you will, get to be very, very similar to, again, from the secularist perspective, the machine that we are, and that some of these other aspects that you're talking about are actually related to our understanding of what a human being is. But if you don't have those, then there seems to be a continuity. that's possible, and perhaps
Okay.
the machine is just the beginning, but 50 years into the future, we're going to get closer and closer to being what a human being is actually like.
Hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think I begin with the presupposition that human beings are ontologically distinct from machines, and that's sort of my starting point, because you will arrive at very different conclusions about what's possible and what's happening, depending on where you start. And Alistair McIntyre once wrote that we can't really decide what we ought to do until we first ask the question of what story are we a part. And I think the biblical story creates the framework that right from the beginning, denotes humankind as distinctly made in the image of God. Even the creation story of humans wasn't just the dust of the earth. There was this breath of the Lord that was part of it. And so to think that we can build living beings out of the dust, just the dust of the earth, I think is mistaken. Humans are ontologically distinct, and we see that right from the beginning. And that's where Dooyeweerd's philosophy, Dooyeweerd, as you mentioned, was a mid 20th or early 20th century philosopher, Dutch philosopher, Christian philosopher. And I actually get the idea of virtue by proxy by building on a prior idea by Nick Breams, who's a professor at Dordt University, who posed the idea of subject by proxy. And then he works with Dooyeweerd with a Dooyeweerdian framework, but he's very quick to sort of invoke Dooyeweerd, who was very much against reductionism. So one of the things that Dooyeweerd's well known for is this idea that we have an irreducible set of aspects in created reality that can't be collapsed down to just matter and energy, or as some folks in computing would like to suggest, just numbers, right, or data. In fact, there's this whole new ideology of dataism that basically says that everything's just data. I think one book I was reading, Homo Deus, had this really striking quote that there's no difference between human beings and tomatoes. They're just different ways of processing data. And so if you begin with that very reductionistic sort of starting point, then yeah, I would say that absolutely you could probably build machines that would not just mimic people, but probably take on much of the functionality. But if you begin with human beings as being ontologically distinct, the created distinct, a body made out of the stuff of the earth, but also a spirit and a soul, and breathed into living beings by God, then we're not going to build machines like that. But I think we'll be able to build machines that are very convincing. They can mimic people. The stochastic parrot is the one quote that I have in this paper. That can so convincingly mimic a human that it'll fool most of the people most of the time. But the fact that something looks like a duck and quacks like a duck doesn't necessarily mean it's a duck. So, there is this philosophy of functionalism, which basically says, if you compare two things, a human and a robot, and the inputs and outputs are basically the same, then for all intents and purposes, the internal states are the same and they're the same machine. And I would say that a Christian understanding of what it means to be human and made in the image of God will mean that we want to keep that ontological distinction, even as machines become more and more capable. And we'll also think about what are appropriate ways to use the machines, right? Areas that require human wisdom and relationship, and judgment, that we ought not to automate, even if, an AI might plausibly, be able to um, stand in, to do those kinds of jobs, that these are things that we ought not to do. So, yeah, the Herman Dooyeweerd is a good philosopher to turn to when you want to avoid a reductionistic view of reality, and so I mentioned him briefly. But the whole virtue by proxy idea is also there, because if there's no agency in the AI, then you can have the AI behave in certain ways that accord with virtue by having the programmer program it in such a way that it behaves and mimics certain kinds of virtues. And so that's the closest I get to kind of suggesting that we might be able to code some kind of virtuous behavior inside of a machine. So so yeah, I think that that addresses some of the things you've raised. Yeah. Thanks for your question,
Okay,
Terry.
good. Thank you, Terry. Okay, we've got Randy Smith over here. Randy, go ahead.
Hello. I sure enjoyed reading your paper. It was really interesting. And it brought to mind in the last few days, I've noticed that ChatGPT has an Android app for your
Mm.
phone, and you can just have long conversations with ChatGPT now,
Yeah.
which I thought was great. I told all my kids about it. You got to check this out. But it made me a little concerned that I could see kids and grandkids that they wouldn't just consume AI information, they would actually just communicate. It would be like one of their best friends, and they would just have conversations over years. And so I'm just curious. I forget, some philosopher said that picking your friends is one of the most important decisions humans can do. Do you think society will be able to keep this in control where we can help pick good friends for our future? Or will this get out of control, and what implications would that have?
Yeah, it seems there's this irresistible urge to create machines in our own image. And I think it's akin to a Tower of Babel, kind of modern day Tower of Babel impulse. Um, but I think, as parents of young children, I think we still have a certain amount of control over the kind of media and the kinds of interactions that our kids have with technology, and I think that will be important. Um, and and so being able to maintain that ontological distinction between machines and people by not treating machines like people. I see it already a little bit with Siri and with Google Home, right? You can actually talk to this device, which is always listening and ready to beckon to your call. And what's interesting is when the device, I find it kind of interesting when the device answers with the first person pronoun, like I can't answer that, or I. It's not an I, there's no there, it's an it. And so building machines that pretend to be human or behave like humans are just going to encourage people to get more and more confused, I think, ontologically. And so, yes, not only are our friends important, but the community that we're part of is important. And so, part of raising up a child in the way they should go is not only, you know, choosing their device interactions wisely, but also placing them within a larger Christian community and neighborhood. I think the last part of my paper talks a bit about virtue in the Christian tradition and how it's unique, and how there are virtues that can only be practiced in community, and whether that's the Christian community or the wider secular community, we need to practice virtue in both of those contexts. And so machines are not going to give us that opportunity. And then, of course, as I mentioned too, there's also the work of the Holy Spirit. There's a wonderful quote here from N.T. Wright, who says that Christian virtues remain both the work of the Spirit and the result of conscious choice and work on the part of the person concerned. And so there's more to it. Some secular writings tend to operationalize virtues and just refer to their outputs and behaviors, but they're much more than that in the Christian tradition. And if you're interested, there's one book by Ken Dunnington, Humility, Pride, and Christian Virtue Theory, where he actually compares humility in secular texts with sort of more ancient Christian virtue theory, and shows how they're actually quite distinct.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just wondering if we should be a little more precise in our understanding of what virtue is. I mean, we throw the word around, and you don't spend a whole lot of time in your article defining it. You do a little bit, but I wonder if we need a little more precision on what we mean, because in general, being virtuous, having virtues, there's different meanings, this word, as we throw it around. Can you comment a little bit more on just uh, what we mean when we say virtue?
Yeah, I've sort of been drawn to my colleague's definition. Rebecca DeYoung defines virtue as, I have this on page one, it's on page 156 at the top. Habits are dispositions of character that help us to live and act well. Um, and these habits help develop character, and then the character um, that gets developed inside of us then helps us to respond uh, to situations in ways that are virtuous. We begin to live and act well because we're trained, um, and uh, and so I think that we have all of these liturgies in our life. And so my other colleague, Jamie Smith, has written about, You Are What You Love is one of his more recent books. And he talks about the power of habits and liturgies, repeated practices, rituals in our lives, in all kinds of different contexts, that shape us and actually shape us into a kind of way of thinking and living, and also have within them an implied story. And it's interesting, Jamie Smith talks about the rituals of the sports stadium, right? I think there's rituals within all kinds of our different activities at work and at school and in the public square. And the purpose, one of the purposes of coming to worship each week, is to be, re-immersed in the biblical story and to repeat, certain rituals within the context of the liturgy of a worship service, to reorient our hearts towards Jesus. So yeah, virtue as habits and dispositions of characters that help us to live and act well, and the way that we cultivate them is through rituals and habits that help shape us, along with the help of the Holy Spirit.
Right. But you do also distinguish between saying that uh, being virtuous is more than just behaving in a
Yeah,
virtuous way. But your
becoming.
definition now
Yeah,
simply
yeah.
was behaving virtuous.
Right, right. It's becoming a certain kind of person, So it's becoming a certain kind of person who then is inclined to behave and respond. I think there's a close connection to also the fruits of the spirit that we cultivate, right? We become, in the
Mm-hmm.
larger context of New Testament, we're called to become more like Christ,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's becoming a
Mm-hmm.
certain kind of person, with certain habits, virtues, fruits that emerge.
Yeah.
And so,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. If
Okay.
it's just behavior, then you could make a machine to behave in a certain.
Right.
It's
That's my point.
becoming.
Yeah.
It's becoming. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe we'll get back to that a little bit. But Terry, you had an add on over there? Your hand is
Um,
still up. Did you bring
yeah,
it
no,
back
no,
up for
yeah.
another one? Okay.
This is a new question. So along those lines, I can actually, I probably can think of virtuous non-Christians who are more virtuous than I am
Mm.
as a believer.
I won't comment.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so I really appreciated your distinction there at the end of the paper on specifically Christian virtue and I think I kind of think that the definition that was given um, from your Calvin colleague uh, falls short just a little bit in that part of Christian virtue is, and this might sound a little um, contradictory, but part of Christian virtue, I think, acknowledges um, our sinfulness and the forgiveness of sins
Mm.
that we have in Christ, and so that's the way that a really a really good non-Christian who acts as well as one can possibly imagine and just like all the time it can be and who falls short and who confesses their sin as part of being virtuous. So I just wondered if you had any further thoughts about how that idea of forgiveness of sin and trusting in Christ for salvation and so on,
Yeah.
is part of virtue.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, right? Point back to the biblical story. So the faith, hope, and love are virtues that go back to the early church fathers. And of course, faith is something that points towards God and Jesus Christ. Hope is something where we have hope for a future that comes about through God's unfolding of his kingdom. And love, which is the call, right? The great command to love God and our neighbor. And so those are virtues that are set right within the biblical story and are unique to Christianity, the theological virtues. But what's interesting, the ancient Greeks were able to discern what I would say some creational realities. They discerned, like as humans, that there are ways that habits can shape us into certain kinds of people. That's the way God created us, and they discern that, and they discern certain cardinal virtues, wisdom, justice, and courage. These are creational virtues that people can cultivate. But looking at the full package of what we're called to be, which is to become more like Jesus, it includes more than just these individual virtues that we can cultivate. It's not going to get us all the way to
Okay.
becoming like Jesus. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Jay Holman, you're looking very ducky today. All right.
We all know about the recent problems that Gemini project that Google has had with their artificial intelligence of being biased and showing the founding fathers as black and Indians and one wonders, I mean, if there's always going to be this bias, are we going to have Fox AI that's going to give you the right algorithm so you can maybe we'll have an ASA one at some point too, so I can really get the truth about science and the faith. I mean, this is a concern, the bias that's being seen.
So what's your question, Jay?
What are your comments about that, and how does that relate
comments.
to
Well,
virtue?
yeah, I
You can make a person culturally different, or try to make somebody culturally different, or you can choose your cultural pathway potentially with whatever form of AI you choose.
Yeah, absolutely. Bias is a huge issue. And I think a really good book that kind of captures many different kinds of biases that emerge when using machine learning is Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, where she looks at all kinds of different ways that bias can influence who gets a loan and who gets a job and who gets parole, and how all of these algorithms have bias because the data set has bias, because data sets are generated by humans, which are sinful creatures. But also, if you read some of the literature, it's not just the data. There's actually the algorithms also have certain types of bias in them. When you're trying to minimize a mathematical function, you're going to favor some of the majority data sets, and the minorities, which have less of a weight in solving an overall minimization or maximization problem, are going to be looked at less. I think the last communications of the ACM, sort of the flagship journal of the ACM, I think it was last month or the month prior, had a whole issue talking about the difficulty of equity and fairness, and how do you actually boil down. I mean, the question is, can you boil justice down to an algorithm? And can you do that well? And I would say that's another kind of reductionism. There are some things that require human wisdom. But the data sets themselves also bring in problems because of existing biases then get amplified. That's one of Kathy O'Neill's premises, that once you deploy these things nationwide or whatever, that they become instruments that amplify these biases that were present. So it's a very complicated thing, and I think this is where we're going to need human wisdom in terms of understanding what sort of things we ought to be automating and things that require more human oversight. I sort of end the paper by quoting Fred Brooks, a Christian computer scientist. He passed away a little while ago now, but Fred Brooks made the argument that rather than focusing on AI, we should be focusing on IA, intelligence augmentation, right? Actually having people and machines work together. And I sort of play off of his Turing Award speech and say, well, rather than having artificial virtue, maybe we should look at virtue amplification or virtue augmentation by actually having machines that help us to exercise virtue. And so having machines and people working alongside each other more, especially when they're making decisions that really can impact people's lives and futures and so on. So yeah, being very aware of that kind of bias and some of the challenges that have come up. And yeah, there's a myriad of examples of that in the literature.
Yeah, can we pursue that a little further? Because I think this
Sure.
is pretty important because, let's put aside this question of distinctiveness of humans. I think we kind of all agree there's a distinctiveness that automated systems have a long way to go, if ever, to get to this point. But it's still, when we think about human beings and how do we get a human being to be more virtuous, or how do we get human beings trained in certain ways, it's basically the data input they get, right? I mean, depending on what channel you get your news from, I mean, you're going to interpret life differently, and you're going to come to different conclusions, different kinds of behavior. And but if I think then in a more simplified way in terms of how AI systems work, we can tune their behavior, as you point out, by our by the input, and determining what is the learning process, what is a series of learning we get. So I'd like your thoughts a little bit on how can we do a better job of training AI systems, of getting them the right databases and ensuring that they're more likely to give virtuous advice. How do we, get an optimal training set or an input data set?
Yeah, even if we want to pursue the virtue by proxy kind of option, where we actually create a machine that can behave more virtuously, how do we do that? Well, the one technique that's being used in a lot of the large language models and can be used in other settings as well is called reinforcement learning from human feedback. So RLHF, where you've got the net with its biases, and I mean, especially in large language models, if you're going to scrape the whole World Wide Web, you're going to have all kinds of not so good data samples of virtuous behavior. And so the RLHF pass requires a small army of people to tamp down the unwanted behaviors of the machine. And it's not bulletproof. I mean, but it can sort of tamp down the inclinations of the large language model to echo, racist or other kinds of biased outputs. And that process is difficult. There's a lot of work that's being done to figure out how to do that better. In fact, if I'm correct, I think one of the large language models that was developed actually went off to a majority world country to hire a small army of people at lower wages in order to do this work, because you're basically constantly being faced with not so nice outputs from these machines, and you have to kind of downvote the outputs that actually create offensive output. The other thing I might add is when you're training a machine using reinforcement learning, you're actually building in a worldview of sorts.
Right.
And so these machines are biased towards certain kinds of worldviews. And if these machines are going to be used, getting back to some prior questions, in order to help our kids learn about the world, or is going to be used as a plug-in in our word processors to give us suggestions for how we ought to write our sentences or paragraphs, or if it's being embedded in text prompts that help us, type messages and so on, that those worldviews are going to be like a little Jiminy Cricket on our shoulder that's going to be nudging us to think and speak in certain ways, um, which over time can actually nudge us to slightly change our opinions and our beliefs about certain things. So yeah, this reinforcement learning with human feedback is the one way that I've been reading about how people have been tamping down these unwanted behaviors. Of course, getting better data sets. Kathy O'Neill in her book Weapons of Math Destruction talks about auditing these machine learning models so that we can, before we deploy them, we sort of have tests, cases, and so on that we can use to see how they actually are responding in certain situations. I think the EU has legislation where they recommend running certain things in a sandbox first before deploying it more widely. And I think these are all good movements towards that. I think regulation actually needs to be another part of it. Maybe I'm opening another can of worms here, but I think that because of these models have the ability to shape public discourse, especially with an election here in our nation, and able to shape our views about things, and because of its ways that it can be deployed that determine whether people get a loan or a job or parole, that we need to focus on regulating these things so that we can avoid
Right.
some of the downsides.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for that, I would remind many of you heard that on our Diving Deeper program last August. We had Joanna Ning here. She
Oh,
was
okay.
plenary speaker, and she emphasized that point exactly that you're saying, that regulation is key here. And one of the most important things she said is transparency of the data sources.
Yeah.
Now that I think that's a step in the right direction. On the other hand, it's not so easy to really understand and to identify whether the data
Yeah.
sources are good. But at least knowing what the data sources are
Yeah.
is helpful rather than anything
And
else.
maybe, for machines that change people's lives, having recourse, to be able to
Yeah,
appeal decisions that,
that's
I
right.
think that the impulse of many corporations is to go towards efficiency, right? And so automating as many things as possible. But I think we have to put the onus back on them, be able to provide other ways for people to
Right.
get justice when these machines are not behaving properly, and then maybe even decide as a society that there are certain things we will not automate, even though we could, because of the problems that it yields,
Yeah,
right? So,
exactly. All right, let's move on. We've got a few more hands up. Peter, good to see you with us.
Yes, thank you. Nice to be with you. You're surely not saying that a perfectly virtuous person has so programmed himself or herself that he really can't help being virtuous and doing good. It's become so ingrained that the freedom of choice has been lost now, and in fact is behaving a bit like a programmed machine. Now that sounds like a caricature, but could you distinguish between that and your actual programmed computer?
yes. So, going back to the two conditions, there needs to be the epistemic condition and the control condition to have agency, where you have, the ability to decide which action you're going to take, and you're aware of what you're doing, and that continues. So habits incline us towards more virtuous or vice-filled behavior, actually. But we always have human responsibility, right? We have freedom and responsibility that we need to exercise as humans, and so virtue is an ongoing response to our responsibility and freedom that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that sounds like a good answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Paul, are you back with us? Have you found the unmute button? You usually have no problem finding it, Paul. Okay. Well, Give you another chance later. Terry.
Yes, I was just going to ask. It seems to me when we use the word bias, with have to be careful what some AI information is coming at us. I think that pretty well, I would think that any source of information is biased if we use the word perspective. Everybody's got a perspective, and I think we should expect that. If we don't like their perspective, we call it a bias. Mm-hmm. I think perhaps we need to train our young people to be, and ourselves to be, good critical thinkers and just assess what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Any comment there?
Technology is not neutral, and data is not neutral either. You're right.
And none of us is without bias, and all of us are shaped by our experience, and we've got a lifetime of it. And AI systems are going to be shaped by their experience. It's in a different sense, but we can influence it. That's right.
Are our school systems training kids to be good critical thinkers?
Well, it depends on who's to judge, right?
Right.
What do we mean by critical? Okay. Oh, Paul. Yeah, there. Paul, good to see you. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you, especially thank you, Derek, for your wisdom on these questions. I'm reminded of a AAAS meeting back in about 2016 when a Dr. Nicolelis from Brazil talked about his research in neuroscience and doing interesting things like causing monkeys to manipulate a control simply by some circuits from the brain. So he was doing a lot of very innovative work in neuroscience, but at the end of the talk, he said he believes that the brain is not computable. And so that's an interesting way of describing a ontological break. And Derek, I wonder if you've heard of that, and how do you respond to that?
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Paul. Paul and I did a presentation at the last ASA conference together on a project we worked on. So yeah, the phrase "the brain is not computable." So a couple of different things. I would say, yeah, the brain is very complex. I'm not a neuroscientist, but a person is also more than their brain. So a person ontologically is not just defined by their brain, but on this complex mind, body, soul kind of ontology that I believe defines what a human is. So the brain is in one sense, built out of biological neurons and stuff that can be simulated in some ways. We can simulate axons and dendrites and nerve cells. But even if we can get accurate simulations of a nerve cell and certain neural nets, that we can't reduce what it means to be human to just a neurological description. So this is the issue. If you're a materialist or a physicalist, then all there is just the electrochemical interactions of the brain, and if that's your presupposition, then it's plausible that we might be able to simulate that with a certain amount of fidelity. But if we have a more rich, more holistic kind of understanding about what it means to be human, a more rich biblical anthropology, then we're much more than our brains. We're right. There's the breath of God, that extra step we read about in Genesis. Story of Ezekiel and the dry bones has the same requirement of the Lord's breath to animate. And so that is certainly not computable, I would say. So yeah. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes. A related question, if I may, is Warren Brown's idea of non-reductive physicalism. regarding his discussion about the meaning of the soul. I wonder if you're familiar with that, have response to that.
I'm not familiar with his particular model, but I'm aware of Christian monism, people who actually don't believe in a dualistic or organic dualistic view of life, that it's all can be explained somehow physically. And I'm very skeptical of that view. I tend to be an organic dualist. I sort of see that we're a complex combination of the stuff of the earth plus God's, breathed in sort of aspect that makes us image bearers of God, distinctly. So which I think is irreducible to a chemical equation, let's say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Paul, if I just may add in a little bit here, the phrase brain isn't computable, I guess that question or that statement can be interpreted different ways. And I think Derek answered a little bit as broadening the brain, thinking of the whole human. But if I just take the organic brain itself and just think about what people have often tried to do in order to emulate its function, well, using our kinds of computers I've been building, at least, I mean, we're all building binary computers, and you're simply not going to be able to do it because it's not computable with a binary system. Now, we've gone beyond simple binary systems to neural networks, which is all the rage these days, and everything's going on. But that too is not the same technology as our brain uses. So we're trying to imitate a function with a very different piece. So I would interpret that phrase, brain isn't computable, is that fundamentally you have a very different kind of mechanism going on. And so it's not going to be reproducible in every respect, but we can do it in a number of things. So, all right, we're getting close to our end here. We've got a few more minutes if there's anything else, but I think it's a fascinating topic, and I think it's going to become more and more relevant as all AI systems impinge more and more upon our lives and influence what's going on. And Peter, got a quick question here before we close?
Yes, I think you're going to have a difficulty in programming your virtuous computer if it has to make moral choices. Because how do you put an algorithm into a choice between doing one good thing and another good thing? That's pretty difficult. You'd have to think about that one.
Yeah, I think, this is where I get back to, avoiding reductionism. I don't think human wisdom can be reduced to an algorithm. I think we're always going to lose something in that, and that human wisdom and justice and some of these other concepts are not expressible in predicate calculus or in algorithmic form. Although we can try to attempt to train a machine based on prior data to kind of make these kinds of decisions. There's always going to be something lacking, especially when you see novel situations like the one you talked about. And then I think there's the issue of human responsibility to what sort of things ought we not to hand off to machines, because it's something that we ought to take responsibility for. This actually goes back to Professor Weizenbaum from MIT in the 1960s. He wrote a famous book called Human Power or Computer Power and Human Reason, in which he built one of the first chatbots called Eliza, which he sort of built a little machine that could be an automated psychotherapist. And then people got really intrigued by this, for automating psychotherapy. And he was completely alarmed. He goes, "Oh my goodness, there are some things we ought not to automate. And there are things like empathy that are required, with another human being when you're talking about things like therapy and psychotherapy and so on." So these questions for some of these questions go way back to the early days of artificial intelligence and people beginning to think about what the possibilities are and what our responsibility is ultimately.
Yep. Very good. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of you for attending and participating. And Derek, really appreciate your article that you wrote, and thank you for joining us in the program and for your insight.
Yeah, thank you for moderating, and thanks for everyone who showed up. It was a delightful conversation.
Okay, that's great. Okay, farewell. Bye-bye.